back to the United States Naval Academy Museum for the final Shifley Lecture of this academic year. We are, as always, very grateful to Vice Admiral Ralph Shifley, his wife Frances, and the class of 1950 for the generous contributions, which really have helped make this museum one of the premier ones around. I have a quick note about next fall's Shifley Lectures. Now, we have had some Naval Institute Press authors before, but next fall will strictly be Naval Institute Press, Naval Institute Proceedings, or Naval History authors. And the reason why is because September 1st, we open a new exhibit called Warrior Writers, The History of the United States Naval Institute, that will last until January 31st. So keep your eyes open for that. Now, for those of you who have been attending the Shifley Lectures for the past 2 years, you know that as the director of the museum, I've been introducing our guest speakers. It's been a wonderful pleasure and honor to meet so many and to be reintroduced to folks I'd worked with before. But I'm going to do something different today, and here's why. They say that teachers aren't supposed to have favorites, but I admit, and I admitted in one of my books, that I do have favorites, and that's the class of 2009. I came in my first semester teaching with them. I watched them grow as midshipmen. I watched them commission. And now, unfortunately, I see them back teaching at the rank I was when I taught them. They were an incredible group of young men and women who are off doing great things, even helicopter pilots. So today, to introduce our speaker, I would like to introduce Lieutenant Jack McCain.
I don't want to steal any more Dr. Trimble's time than I have to, but it is my very distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. William Trimble. He earned his PhD from the University of Colorado Boulder. He's the author of 8 books and numbers of articles. He earned the 2011 Radford Award for Excellence in Naval Aviation in History and Literature from Naval Aviation Museum Foundation. He currently serves as the class of 1957 Distinguished Chair of Naval Heritage in the History Department of the United States Naval Academy. If there's one lesson our military learns at least once a generation, it's that an ignorance of history is an intolerable sin. Well, today we have Dr. Trimble, a man exceedingly well qualified to tell that history. Our history, and a history that, while I am very biased due to the personal nature of this subject, has never been more important than with today's carrier fleet. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. William Trimble.
Wow. That was kind of a bait and switch there, Claude. I mean, thank you very much, Jack. I really appreciate it. Claude, thank you, and thanks to the museum. Thanks to the Shifley family, excuse me, I knew I'd mispronounced that. And also the class of 57. I wouldn't be here and doing some of this stuff if it weren't for the class of 57. It's really been a real pleasure for me to be here. It's been a learning experience for me, perhaps more than anything else. And now at my age 68, I'm still learning things, which I think is really good. Let me give some background on how I got to this point with John McCain Sr. Some of you who know Jim Bradford, who preceded me as one of the class of 57 professors, called me one day, and I can't even remember when it was. I think it was sometime around 2010, and said, "What are you doing?" And I'm going, "Well, I'm not really doing anything other than maybe sitting here watching TV or a football game or something." And he said, "Have you finished your Curtis book?" The last book I did for the Naval Institute Press was on Glenn Curtis in early naval aviation. I did that for the centennial in 2010 and in 2011. I said, "Well, right now, Jim, I really don't have anything to do." And he said, "Well, I'm editing this biography series for the Naval Institute Press, and I'm looking for people to do biographies. You've done biographies before, obviously, and maybe you can do this." And I said, "Well, yeah, do you have anybody in mind?" He said, "How about John McCain?" And I, of course, go, "John McCain," and then you have to go through the, genealogy here, pretty much, where you figure that out. And I said, "Well, that's okay, Jim. I think that's a good idea. I like it because it kind of bookends what I've done, very early naval aviation versus later naval aviation." So that intrigued me. The name obviously had recognition, so that was also something that interested me very much. And then I said, and I know nothing about World War II and I know nothing about operational history. So there you go. I'm starting with pretty much a blank slate here. Also, I had some reservations about this, in particular because it didn't take me very long to find that there's a biography of John McCain Sr. out there by Keith Gilbert. It was published in 2006. And it's really pretty good in many ways. The guy's a journalist. I haven't met him, I haven't talked with him, but it's really pretty well written, pretty well put together. And so I wanted to read that thoroughly before I made any kind of a commitment to this. And the more I read, the more I felt that there was more to say in terms of the story. There were things that even I knew about this man's career that he didn't have in the biography. The citations were not necessarily the kind of citations that we professional historians like to have. So I said back to Jim, yeah, I can do this. And then I wrote to the Naval Institute Press and said, are you really interested in me doing this? They said, fine. When can you get a manuscript to us? And I said, well, how about December 14? Well, guess what, folks? It's no longer December 14th, and I am still a long way away from finishing this thing. So that's the background to this, and I really went into it with a lot of reservations. I've been doing this kind of thing for a long time, but never gotten into World War II, never gotten into operational history. So for me, it was really very much of a revelation to start looking at this stuff. And going into it, too, with some concerns because you have all this stuff written on World War II in the Pacific, right? What can you add to it? And the more you dig into it, you see, well, there's a lot of stuff on Midway, and there's the Morrison stuff, right? And to a certain extent, people have assumed that once Midway has been covered and once Morrison has done his work some time ago, you don't really add very much to what's already done in World War II in the Pacific. And there's a lot more out there, let me put it that way. And that astonished me too and encouraged me to keep going with the project. So what I want to do is just have an overview here, and I'll emphasize that this is really quick and dirty because I want to open it up to questions. I'm sure you have all kinds of questions. I still have questions about what this all means. So that's what I would like to do. And if I can push the right button, we'll be there. As far as his early naval career is concerned, I have to qualify this by saying I really haven't dug into this very much. I decided when I got into the project that I wanted to focus on World War II because that was what I knew least about. And I figured that would be a good place to start here in terms of getting a basic narrative together. So as far as where I am in the project, I've drafted 7 chapters now, primarily dealing with his activities during World War II. So I'm just going to go quickly through his earlier career. He was born in Mississippi in 1884, went for 1 year to the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, and then transferred to the Naval Academy and graduated in the class of 1906. There were a lot of important people in that class, in fact, people he would run into later in his career, like Frank Jack Fletcher is one of them, Robert Gormley is another one of these, Jake Fitch, and you can go on and on and on about the people who were in that class who he ran into later on in his career. When he got out of the Naval Academy, he went almost immediately to the Asiatic Fleet. He was out there for, I think, about a year, or maybe a little bit longer than a year. And there he hooked up with the Great White Fleet. The Great White Fleet was on its circumnavigation and was coming back across the Pacific, and he joined one of the battleships there to complete that journey across the Indian Ocean and then finally across the Atlantic back home. He served in World War I. Most of the time he served in World War I was aboard the cruiser San Diego. And the San Diego was important in terms of providing escort duties across the Atlantic during the war. Interestingly here, he rotated off the San Diego just about a month or maybe 6 weeks before it was sunk off the Atlantic coast. It was the only major warship that the Navy lost during World War I, and he rotated off that just before that happened. Part of his career, a good deal of his career, was spent in Washington. Starting in 1919, I believe it was, he was assigned to the Bureau of Navigation. The Bureau of Navigation was responsible for personnel. That was a powerful bureau. It later became Bureau of Personnel. He spent 4 tours with the Bureau of Navigation in Washington for more than 10 years. So this guy knew how Washington worked. He knew the politics of Washington and knew how administration worked in Washington. So you can see he's got a varied career here, and that fascinated me as well. Not only do you have the sea duty, not only do you have the operational stuff, But here you have somebody who has that administrative background as well. He rotated on and off sea duty. This is the USS Nitro, which was an ammunition ship. He was by this time a captain and was commanding officer of the Nitro. That was not his first command. He had a brief command before that. So he was rotating on and off sea duty, usually two tours, 2 years of sea duty, and then maybe 3 years of shore duty. I'm not really sure, among the many questions I have here, I'm not really sure when or how or even where he became interested in aviation. I've written a lot about people who have been involved in aeronautics in various ways. And you see all kinds of things. You know, you'll see their reminiscences saying, I was always interested in airplanes from a kid. And you're careful with some of that. As far as McCain was concerned, it may have happened when he was on board as executive officer of the New Mexico. And there he ran into people who were interested in aviation, in particular a guy named Herbert Riley, who was going to Pensacola in aviation. And at least according to Riley's oral history, he says, I talked to McCain as the exec, and McCain said, boy, I would really like to go to Pensacola. Why don't we just swap jobs here? You become exec here, and I'll go to Pensacola. So that would have been maybe 1926 or 1927. Certainly by the early 1930s, he was interested in aviation. And part of the reason he got involved with this was a problem in seniority that the Navy had, especially as far as aviation officers were concerned. They wanted to have people who had aviation experience to gain carrier command. The problem was you didn't have many senior captains who were qualified for carrier command who had the aviation experience. So what the Navy did was to select certain people who were interested in this, who were more senior captains in line for a carrier command or some other kind of senior command, and send them to Pensacola. And that's exactly what happened with McCain. In 1936. At age 52, he went to Pensacola and earned his wings. The only person who was more senior to him, if you will, was William Halsey, who was about 6 months older than him, still age 52, at Pensacola. After that, this is a little bit out of sequence chronologically, after that he did receive a carrier command, and that was the USS Ranger that you see here. The Ranger was the first American carrier that was built as a carrier from the keel up. He would have preferred one of the bigger carriers, but he was really happy with the Ranger when he got that command. And he was responsible for some developments with the Ranger, working with the fleet and some of the fleet problems during the latter part of the 1930s in particular. That's his carrier experience up to this point. Another dimension of this guy, and this was also what fascinated me, was that he was also involved with what were known as VPs, or patrol squadrons. And here he had his first experience, actually it was his first aviation experience, at Coco Solo in the Canal Zone, operating these VPs that were flying out of that naval air station. He then went from Coco Solo to San Diego and was commander of patrol squadrons operating out of North Island in the latter part of the 1930s, and this carried over into 1941 and 1942, into the first part of World War II. So he had this experience not only of carrier command, but he had this experience as well of the seaplane command, basically, or the patrol aircraft. Probably somewhere in this range here, in the late 1930s, maybe at Coco Solo, he ran into Ernest King. King was also very much interested in the VPs and the long-range search, especially considering the distance problems, the range problems that you had in the Pacific, and how they could add to the reconnaissance and patrol dimensions that you had in the Pacific. So probably at that point he ran into Ernest King. And they got along very well. There's no question about this. King supported McCain throughout McCain's career. And you see people referring to McCain as a King man as a result. And then I have here missed opportunities, and this is one that fascinates me. In March of 1942, he was still in San Diego. The carrier Hornet was new and working up and came around to San Diego. And at that point, Nimitz said, I would like to have McCain take over command of the Hornet. And at that point, King wrote to Nimitz and said, hold off on that because we have some other ideas about what we want to do with the Hornet. And Nimitz at this point didn't know what was going on. I don't think McCain ever found out what was going on here. But the reason why King said hold off was that he wanted Mitcher and Halsey to take the Enterprise and the Hornet on the Doolittle Tokyo raid. So there was a missed opportunity. He could have had that carrier command right then had it not been for the Halsey Doolittle raid. The next phase of his career, and this relates to what he was doing in the patrol squadrons and the experience he had in San Diego with the patrol squadrons, was to go out to the South Pacific. And I have here the strategic dilemma. And this, especially for people who have been teaching 104, you guys know what the strategic dilemma was. First of all, how much resources do you have to devote to the European war, which was priority number one? How much resources, or how many resources or assets do you have to devote to the South, to the Pacific in particular? So that was a problem that they had. How much of a defensive can you maintain in the Pacific at the same time carrying out an offensive in Europe? So that was part of the problem. Another problem was the Navy had always been focused, especially Nimitz at this point, been focused on operations in the Central Pacific. And meanwhile, things were happening in the South Pacific that were important. And King especially said, hey, we need to pay more attention here to what's going on in the South Pacific, because that is right in our lines of communication between our West Coast and Australia and New Zealand. So largely as a result of King, some of the emphasis here was on the South Pacific more than the Central Pacific. At this point, and this is what? This is May of 1942, they began to set up a command structure in the South Pacific. Gormley was going to become the commander of all naval forces in the South Pacific. And then nominally under him, McCain was out there as what was known as Commander Aircraft Pacific Force. I think you can maybe see that, or South Pacific Force, ComAir SOPAC. So that was his responsibility in the South Pacific under Gormley. What he was responsible for was all land-based and all tender-based aviation. In other words, all the VPs, whatever fighters or land-based strike aircraft were available in the South Pacific were under his responsibility. And that included not only Navy aircraft, but it included Army Air Forces aircraft and also New Zealanders. So he was operating a conglomeration, if you will, of land-based and tender-based aircraft at that point. And he was involved, or his forces were involved in two of the key battles here following the invasion of Guadalcanal in August of 1942. One of them was the Battle of Savo Island. And I'm going to defer a little bit on that because that leads to one of the controversies that I've been working with as far as McCain is concerned. His VPs were responsible for the searches to determine what Japanese forces may be intervening at Guadalcanal. He was also involved in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Again, responsible for land-based, tender-based searches that are out there looking for and trying to identify whatever Japanese forces may be intervening at Guadalcanal. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see the PBY-5. It's an amphibian that was his aircraft as ComAir SOPAC. Down here, you can see one of the advanced seaplane bases that they set up on the island of Espiritu Santo. This was the whole Guadalcanal or Solomon's operation at this point was known as Operation Shoestring. That was what people called it that. People called it that. It was Watchtower was the official name for the operation. The reason they called it shoestring was they didn't have much to work with here. They were really scraping the bottom of the barrel to be able to carry out any kind of offensive here as well. And you see the correspondence, you see the reports. McCain is really struggling here to get enough resources to be able to carry out his operations at that time. He was relieved of his command in October of 1942, and that is also one of the controversies that I have tried to dig into some. It's a very complicated story that involves not just him, but also John Towers, one of his classmates from 1906, who King did not get along with very well in Washington. Towers was then BU Air Chief. King liked McCain, thought McCain would make a good replacement for Towers, wanted to have McCain come back to Washington as BU Air Chief as Towers went out to work with Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. It was a complicated change in command there in the fall of 1942. So he was Chief of Bureau of Aeronautics. He was Chief of Bureau of Aeronautics from October of 1942 to June of 1943. And there he was really digging into the administration of how you fought the war in Washington. He was responsible for a lot of the training exercises that were done, a lot of the training and planning that was done, aircraft procurement, especially trying to get the numbers and types of aircraft that were going to be needed to fight this war. He was doing all of that while he was in Washington at that point. He was in that job until August of 1943, when he rotated out of that and took a new position as Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air. What King had wanted to do for some time was to bring all of the operational aspects of naval aviation into the office of the CNO. Before this, it tended to be scattered, but most of it was in BuAer. And what he hoped to do was to bring it all under his more direct control in his office, especially the operational and planning aspects of it. And McCain was willing to go along with this as BuAer chief, and he was also a good friend of King. So he took over that job in August of 1943 and was in that job until August of 1944. He was in that job for a year. There he was pretty much doing the same things that he did as Chief BuAer, planning a lot of the procurement aspects of it, especially working out the arrangements to make sure that the numbers of aircraft that were produced matched up with the losses that were taking place in the Pacific. And one of the problems he ran into was that they were actually outproducing. There were more aircraft that they were trying to get out there than were being used up. So as a consequence of this, they had to work out a very sophisticated way of inventory control more than anything else to be able to match up the numbers of aircraft that were being produced with the aircraft that were being used out, especially in the Pacific. He went back to the Pacific then in August of 1944. He went out there as a consequence of a decision that was made by King and by Nimitz together, saying that we really don't want to wear out these commanders. It would be much better to bring out one of these commanders and their staffs, carrier commanders and their staffs, to give them a bit of a breather, to let them start working on the next plans, and then rotate another group in there under another commander. They worked this out by May of 1944. And the understanding here, and a lot of you are pretty familiar with this, I think, was that Halsey would take over what became known as Task Force, take over what was known as the Third Fleet, and under him, McCain would take over what was Task Force 38. That was the Fast Carrier Task Force. They would then rotate with Raymond Spruance, who was commander of the Fifth Fleet, and Mark Mitcher, who was commander of Task Force 58. Basically, the forces didn't change. They were the same. Simply the upper level of the hierarchy of the command structure and staffs changed. Even the staff sometimes didn't change that much. So McCain was now in position here to take over Task Force 38 as the fast carrier commander. I wish it were that simple. Mitcher did not want to rotate out when Spruance rotated back. This was before the Leyte Gulf operations. Mitcher said, I want to stay on. Under Halsey. So Mitcher, who was nominally Task Force 58 commander, now said, I want to be Task Force 38 commander. Well, McCain was supposed to take that over. So King now had a dilemma. Well, Nimitz had a dilemma as well. What do you do? Well, why don't we break this down? Mitcher can be commander first Fast Carrier Task Force, right? And then McCain can be commander second Fast Carrier Task Force. How happy do you think McCain was about that? Not very happy, but he wasn't in a position to say very much about it. So you get this odd command relationship going into the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where McCain is commander second Fast Carrier Task Force, in command of a task group within Task Force 38 that he nominally should have been commander of, and under Mitcher in that case, but still everybody under Halsey. Everybody understand that? I mean, really complicated stuff. So he was involved with the Battle of Leyte Gulf as a task group commander. Initially, he was not involved with this because at a certain point, as the battle began to mature, let me put it that way, Halsey rotated him and his task group off to replenish at Ulithi. And he's on his way back. At that point, this is all very complicated stuff. At that point, Halsey had found the Japanese carriers, said, hey, you need to get back here to help me out. Turn your task group around, get back and help me out to go after the Japanese carriers. Meanwhile, McCain is listening in to the communications that are going on and finds out that Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, who was in charge of the 7th Fleet, was in trouble at Leyte Gulf. And without even waiting for orders from Halsey, he decides, I'm going to go help out Kinkaid at Leyte. And he was able to do that. He launched at extremely long range and did have some effect at that point in the battle, clearly displaying initiative on his own as in charge of that. I should add here that the image shows Admiral McCain with John or Jimmy Thatch, who was his air operations officer. One of the things about McCain was that he really was very good in terms of understanding who could work with him, who could help him, and delegating authority. And he identified Thatch as one of these people almost immediately. Eventually, he did take over Task Force 38, and especially operations in support of the Lingayen Gulf landings in January of 1945 in the Philippines, carrying out these air operations against Japanese, primarily land forces in Luzon. Task Force 38 went into the South China Sea in January of 1945 and carried out very extensive operations there against the Japanese. And then very late in the war, he rotated out. Spruance came back in with 5th Fleet, and then very late in the war, in late May of 1945, Halsey and McCain came back as Commander 3rd Fleet and Task Force 38. This time the primary mission was to attack Japan. And Task Force 38 at that point ranged up and down the coast of Japan, essentially carrying out strategic strikes against Japanese industrial targets, airfields, and a variety of other targets that were naval oriented. All right, what did this mean? And I'll admit here that I'm still struggling trying to get the significance of what Admiral McCain did, what it meant in terms of how naval aviation changed from the 1930s to 1945, the end of the war. I should add that right at the end of the war, after VJ Day, he went home and died presumably of a heart attack only a day after he got back home in San Diego at age 61. So how do you make sense of this? Well, one of the things that I see here is that he was there doing joint operations before people even knew what joint operations were. And especially here in 1942 at Guadalcanal, when he did not have much to work with. Being able to work with Navy people, New Zealanders, and working with Army Air Forces people was really a major achievement as far as I can tell. One of the things was that he got along very well with the Army Air Forces people. He had B-17s under his command there. And the B-17, or the Army Air Forces B-17 commander, and he worked very well together during that time. He was also responsible for, in many ways, the development of multi-carrier operations and multi-carrier task forces. And you have to put this in perspective. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, one of the American task forces there had one carrier in it. The other one had 2 carriers in it. By January 1945, Task Force 38 has task groups that are operating up to 5 aircraft carriers together. Just being able to coordinate that, being able to handle the complexity of that, and also you have multiple task groups that are involved. So you may have 16, 17, 18 carriers involved with this. The evolution of that is complex. And McCain was there, Thatch was there to a certain extent, other people were there as well trying to work that out certainly by the early part of 1945. And then what he was doing in Washington was absolutely critical. The administration, the planning, the procurement, acquisition of aircraft was very complex and important to do for this war. And it's something that particularly interested me because I've always been more interested in the infrastructure, the administrative aspects of naval aviation than the operational aspects of it. So what he did in Washington in the middle of the war was very important. This is only a handful of the controversies that he became involved with. Savo and the Eastern Solomons to begin with. Remember, he's responsible for many of the searches that took place in advance of the Battle of Savo Island. Savo Island took place just after the Guadalcanal landings, when a Japanese cruiser force intervened, sank 4 Allied cruisers, I think 2 destroyers as well, and very nearly disrupted the Guadalcanal landings. He was responsible for the searches. He did not find the Japanese fleet. And many historians say, as a person who was responsible for that, and not finding the Japanese fleet and providing warning, he's certainly culpable as far as that operation was concerned. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons, again, he's responsible for the searches, right? Or at least the land-based and tender-based searches, the VPs. In this case, he did much better. He found one element of the Japanese forces. He found the element that was going to land a significant number of troops on Guadalcanal to try to re-seize the island. And he spotted that force and the carrier, which was important then for Admiral Fletcher to carry out an air attack on it and sink that carrier. He did not, however, find the main Japanese carrier force at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The relationship between McCain and Halsey is something that I really have to think about and try to sort out, and I haven't done it that much. I haven't really succeeded in that yet. Clark Reynolds has got perhaps the best single volume on the fast carrier task forces during World War II. And he makes the argument in that book that McCain simply was along for the ride, let me put it that way, as far as Halsey was concerned. That he never made any tactical decisions whatsoever as Task Force 38 commander. They were all made by Halsey. Well, Reynolds is a good historian, but I began to think about that. I'm still thinking about this and trying to sort this out. Surely they had some respect for each other and respect for that command relationship. Yes, he was subordinate to Halsey, but I find it hard to believe that he turned over all tactical decisions and decisions about operations to Halsey. Now, Halsey was a strong personality. There's no question about that. So that complexity of that relationship is something that I think needs to be looked at more clearly or more carefully than what Reynolds has done. I'm not quite there yet on that as well. And then you have 2 Typhoons. The first of these, these were both in the area of the Philippines. Well, one was in the area of Japan, one was in the area of the Philippines. In December 1944, Halsey, 3rd Fleet and Task Force 38 ran into a typhoon in the middle of trying to carry out very complex refueling operations. What happened here? Obviously, you're commanders of 3rd Fleet and you're commanders of Task Force 38. You're responsible. Destroyers were sunk, lives were lost. There was an investigation of this. It found primarily that Halsey was responsible or culpable in this, said that he had made mistakes, did not recommend that he be relieved, and then by mostly association more than anything else, McCain was also responsible for the disaster in December 1944. If that wasn't bad enough, in June 1945, off Japan, Halsey, 3rd Fleet, Task Force 38 under McCain ran into a second typhoon. It wasn't as devastating in terms of the damage that was done or the lives that were lost, but here are 2 typhoons that you've run into. They will give you 1 typhoon. They will not give you 2 typhoons. And this literally went right up the line to King, and King made a decision: we are not going to fire Halsey, but somebody is going to have to be fired, and ultimately that was McCain. Now, he wasn't fired immediately. He continued to carry out the command of Task Force 38 right through the end of the war, and then right maybe 2 days before the end of the war, he was relieved by John Towers. And he was then going to go back home to become head of the Veterans Administration. So here you have a controversy really right at the end of this man's career that I still have to sort my way through. So what's it mean? What I like about it is that here is naval aviation. And here are various aspects and dimensions of naval aviation. Here's carrier aviation, and sometimes you think that that's all there is of naval aviation, right, is carrier aviation. But there's more to that. And the whole patrol plane side of this, the whole VP side of this story, is something that interests me. And here was a guy who was involved with both that and with carrier aviation. So you get that multidimensionality of that, which I like a lot. One of the things that Clark Reynolds says is that there was a transition here during the war between 1942 and maybe early 1945, where the aircraft carrier became not so much a tactical weapon as it was by 1945 a strategic weapon. And I went, yeah, there's something going on here. How did that transition take place? Why did that transition take place? And what does somebody like McCain have to do with it? And then I'm talking with other people here, and that's why this class of 57 professorship has been very helpful, talking to C.C. Felker and talking to David O'Hora about really what this means. They said, well, maybe there's another way of looking at this. Maybe what you're talking about in 1942 is something more directly related to sea control. Sure, it's tactical, but it involves something else here. And then by 1945, you're talking about aircraft carriers and power projection. And yeah, that's strategic, but there are also other aspects of that that you may want to play around with. So I'm still trying to piece this together. I do not have a complete book manuscript. I don't have books out there that you can sign. The Naval Institute Press is interested in this. I don't even have a contract with those guys, although I've done a number of books with them, and I'm sure that that won't be a problem. And again, I was hoping to finish this by December of 2014. I didn't quite get there. You guys in the history department have kept me busy doing other things this year. But I hope when I get back home at Auburn University in Auburn, Alabama, I should have some chance to try to finish up some of these chapters and make more sense out of it. I don't know whether I was able to pull that off as quickly as I could have or should have. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. I probably have more questions than you folks have, so I'll be happy to do that. Anyone? Yeah, let me go over here.
You said that the Navy commander can get one Typhoon, but not two.
But not two, yeah.
I think if I got that right, you mean getting caught unprepared.
Well, there are two ways of looking at it, yeah. Certainly being caught unprepared. You know, if you've already been in one Typhoon, you would think that you would be prepared and ready for another Typhoon. And when you wind up in a second Typhoon, then people are saying, well, that's just not excusable. One of the things I found in the operation of the South China Sea, both McCain and Halsey they ran into bad weather all the time. Bad weather, especially in January of '45, really dominated the kind of operations they were doing. They were afraid that they were going to run into a typhoon there, and were operating perhaps more conservatively than Nimitz liked. And Nimitz radios them and says, hey, you know, I think that typhoon's going this way. You can continue your operations and not worry about it. But I know those guys had it in the back of their mind. They don't want to run into another typhoon here in January after they just run into one in December. I don't know whether to answer your question or not. Yeah?
Follow up with that question, was it more of an issue talking about being prepared for the typhoon, or was there what was the state of meteorology at the time? I mean, is it more a question of you can only be prepared for a typhoon.
Right.
You go into a typhoon, how prepared you are, you would be hurricane. But was there an issue of forecasting, and did they have the tools available?
Sure. The tools were much better by June of '45. By that time, Nimitz had set up a central weather operation that provided much better information than they had even in December of '44. And the individual, I'm sure the experiences of this, from December within the individual task groups and the carrier officers as well, was more sophisticated. It's nothing like it is today, obviously. And again, this is some of the dilemmas that you have as a commander. You're getting different information. Some people are saying, hey, the typhoon's this way, it's going this way. Other people say, no, it's not. I know where it is and I know best. How do you handle that as a commander when you get that conflicting information? So it was a difficult situation they ran into. There's no question about it.
The other question I actually had that prompted that one, but on the patrol squadrons,
yeah.
Was there it seemed like during the war, did the whole patrol plane squadron kind of start drifting up over the horizon, over the sunset, and the carrier started ascending? Was that kind of the picture? There's a lot of the patrol stuff going on in the 20s and the 30s.
Yeah. To a certain extent, that is the case. But you also had very active patrol plane squadrons out there searching for, I don't know whether they're finding elements of the Japanese fleet before the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Well, they wouldn't have found them because it was the submarines who found them. I'm trying to remember where they were operating out of. Manus, I think, at that point. They kept moving them up And of course they had that advantage of mobility to be able to carry this out. So they were still there, but the carriers are taking over much more of this on their own rather than being augmented or augmenting the VPs. There's a story to be told there that I can't find anywhere about what were all these VPs doing out there in the Pacific through the entire war. And clearly the carriers are the glamour boys, if you will, and they're getting most of the attention by historians in particular. Anyone else? Surely. Other questions? Yeah. Yes.
What have you found in the research that you've done as far as maybe, for lack of a better term, responsibility or higher ranking individuals taking credit for things that McCain did or things that he had a lot of influence on and saying, well, I'm the guy over him, so I'm responsible for this, and I'm the guy who did it all. Has that come across in the research, or has that never really been explored?
Yeah, I don't think I've directly come across that in terms of what I've looked at with McCain, but some of that might be involved in the McCain-Halsey relationship and the complexity of that. I certainly haven't run across anything so far where, well, here again, I'm limited by the sources I have. Haven't run across anything where McCain is directly saying, hey, Halsey's taking credit for things that I have been doing here. Or any of his subordinate commanders, and I've looked at some of those, saying, hey, McCain's taking credit for some of the things that I've been doing. In one of the previous books I did on William Moffett, I began thinking about that. He's signing all these documents, right? But you really know that he's not involved. He's delegated a lot of this, and he's simply signing off on it. So how much of it is really his? How much of it is coming out of subordinates? It's really hard to untangle that when you're trying to look through the sources. I don't think that answered your question either. Yeah, I don't know whether I'm going to get out of it. You get from people who have been associated with him, I would say the vast majority say that he was a good guy to work with. He was able. He was a wonderful person personally, and they liked working with him. You also have a minority out there who didn't like him very much. Towers is one of those people who say, you can't work with this guy. I don't think he ever said anything that he wasn't personable or a nice guy, but he said, I simply can't work with this guy. And other people have said, and again, this is a minority, saying that his command style was disorganized. He did not run a tight ship, if you want to call it that way, and he was difficult to work for as a subordinate as a result. And as a consequence, people, guess what? Surprise, surprise, like working with Mitcher and Spruance more than they liked working with McCain and Halsey. Again, Towers is one of those people. Jerry Bogan is one of those people who found it harder to work with McCain and Halsey than with Spruance and Mitchell, or vice versa. Yeah?
For the benefit of the ship and working on research
Okay.
papers, can you tell us a little something about the best primary sources you found in doing your research?
Yeah. The nice thing about this, folks, if you want to get into this stuff, especially the operational World War II stuff, is something called Fold 3. I knew nothing about Fold 3 until I had a long conversation with John Lundstrom. John Lundstrom is the person for American naval aviation operations in the Pacific in 1942. After 1942, he's not interested, so he only goes through Midway and Guadalcanal. He said, you've got to look at Fold 3. And I said, what? And it's FOLD 3. I said, okay, let me check it out. What it has in there, these are copies of action reports and war diaries for practically every unit that operated in every Navy unit that, well, it's not just Navy, Army and Army Air Forces as well, but it's particularly every Navy unit that operated in World War II. Those are also available, if you want, at the National Archives in College Park, but believe me, it's a lot easier to go on Fold 3 and have them online right there on your desk. So that's been fabulous. What I've primarily been working with have been those war diaries, those action reports, some specific correspondence relating to operations in the Pacific in particular that I've gotten from the National Archives. The Buer records are really good for his, this is RG-72. I spent a lot of time in Buer records. at the National Archives are very good for his Buaire experience in World War II. And then the Chief of Naval Operations, in fact, last time I was at the archives was last December. I was looking at Chief of Naval Operations records, specifically the DCNO stuff and some of the negotiations he had with the Army Air Forces about who's going to be in control of land-based air and who's going to be in control of especially coastal operations. And folks, College Park is not that far away. So there's just a lot of really good stuff there. Okay? Claude, does that help?
Thank you. Yep, that's it. Thank
Okay.
you very much, Bill.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.